and through the soft grasses at the bottom, and all the while we listened as if the air was a speaking trumpet. Then gladly we breasted our nags to the rise, and were coming to the comb of it, when I heard something, and caught John's arm, and he bent his hand to the shape of his ear. It was the sound of horses' feet knocking up through splashy ground, as if the bottom sucked them, then a grunting of weary men, and the lifting noise of stirrups, and sometimes the clank of iron mixed with the wheezy croning of leather, and the blowing of hairy nostrils. "God's sake, Jack, slip round her belly and let her go where she wull." As John Fry whispered, so I did, for he was off Smiler by this time, but our two pads were too fagged to go far, and began to nose about and crop, sniffing more than they need have done. I crept to John's side very softly with the bridle on my arm. "Let goo, Bradle, let goo, lad. Plaise God they take them for forest ponies, or they'll zend a bullet through us." I saw what he meant, and let go of the bridle, for now the mist was rolling off, and we were against the skyline to the dark cavalcade below us. John lay on the ground by a barrow of heather, where a little gullet was, and I crept up to him, afraid of the noise I made in dragging my legs along, and the creak of my cord breeches. John bleated like a sheep to cover it, a sheep very cold and trembling. Then just as the foremost horseman passed, scarce 20 yards below us, a puff of wind came up the glen, and the fog rolled off before it, and suddenly a strong red light, cast by the cloud weight downwards, spread like fingers over the moorland, opened the alleys of darkness, and hung on the steel of the riders. "Dunkery Beacon," whispered John, so close into my ear that I felt his lips and teeth ashake. "Dunn't fire it now except to show the Doones way home again, since the night as they went up and throwed the watchman atop it. Why, what be about, lad? God's sake!" For I could keep still no longer, but wriggled away from his arm, and along the little gullet, still going flat on my breast and thighs, until I was under a grey patch of stone, with a fringe of dry fern around it. There I lay, scarce 20 feet above the heads of the riders, and I feared to draw my breath, though prone to do it with wonder. For now the beacon was rushing up in a fiery storm to heaven, and the form of its flame came and went in the folds, and the heavy sky was hovering. All around it was hung with red, deep in twisted columns, and then a great beard of fire streamed throughout the darkness. The sullen hills were flanked with light, and the valleys chined with shadow, and all the sombrous moors between awoke in furrowed anger. But most of all the flinging fire leaped into the rocky mouth of the glen below me, where the horsemen passed in silence, scarcely deigning to look round. Heavy men and large of stature, reckless how they bore their guns, or how they sate their horses, with leathern jerkins, and long boots, and iron plates on breast and head, plunder heaped behind their saddles, and flagons slung in front of them. I counted more than 30 pass, like clouds upon red sunset. Some had carcasses of sheep swinging with their skins on, other had deer, and one had a child flung across his saddle bow. Whether the child were dead or alive was more than I could tell, only it hung head downwards there, and must take the chance of it. They had got the child, a very young one, for the sake of the dress no doubt, which they could not stop to pull off from it, for the dress shone bright where the fire struck it, as if with gold and jewels. I longed in my heart to know most sadly what they would do with the little thing, and whether they would eat it. It touched me so to see that child, a prey among those vultures, that in my foolish rage and burning I stood up and shouted to them, leaping on a rock, and raving out of all possession. 2 of them turned round, and one set his carbine at me, but the other said it was but a pixie, and bade him to keep his powder. Little they knew, and less thought I, that the pixie then before them would dance their castle down one day. John Fry, who in the spring of fight had brought himself down from Smiler's side, as if he were dipped in oil, now came up to me, all risk being over, cross and stiff, and aching sorely from his wet couch of heather. "Small thanks to thee, Janet, as my new wife bain't a wedder. And who be you to support of her, and her son if she have one? Zarve thee right if I was to chuck thee down in the Doone track. Zim thee'll come to un, sooner or later, if this be the zample of thee." And that was all he had to say, instead of thanking God. For if ever born man was in a fright, and ready to thank God for anything, the name of that man was John Fry, not more than 5 minutes agone. However, I answered nothing at all, except to be ashamed of myself, and soon we found Peggy and Smiler in company, well embarked on the homeward road, and victualling where the grass was good. Right glad they were to see us again, not for the pleasure of carrying, but because a horse, like a woman, lacks, and is better without, self-reliance. My father never came to meet us at either side of the telling house, neither at the crooked post, nor even at the home linhay, although the dogs kept such a noise that he must have heard us. Home side of the linhay, and under the ashen hedgerow, where father taught me to catch blackbirds, and all at once my heart went down, and all my breast was hollow. There was not even a lanthorn light on the peg against the cow's house, and nobody said "Hold your noise" to the dogs, or shouted "Here our Jack is." I looked at the posts of the gate, in the dark, because they were tall, like father, and then at the door in the harness room, where he used to smoke his pipe and sing. Then I thought he had guests perhaps, people lost upon the moors, whom he could not leave unkindly, even for his son's sake. And yet about that I was jealous, and ready to be vexed with him, when he should begin to make much of me, and I felt in my pocket for the new pipe which I had brought him from Tiverton, and said to myself, "He shall not have it until tomorrow morning." Woe is me, I cannot tell. How I knew I know not now, only that I slunk away without a tear or thought of weeping, and hid me in a sawpit. There the timber overhead come like streaks across me, and all I wanted was to lack, and none to tell me anything. By and by a noise came down, as of women's weeping, and there my mother and sister were, choking and holding together. Although they were my dearest loves, I could not bear to look at them until they seemed to want my help, and put their hands before their eyes. End of chapter 3. Recording by Shirley Anderson.